Today, the Finance Minister, Colm Ilmbert, announced in Trinidad and Tobago that the upcoming budget is going to be presented on the 30th of September. So I thought it would be really interesting to talk about how budgets inform public sector procurement. I've got my notes here, and I've got 7 key areas that I'm going to talk about on its importance and how it affects it. So in the first area, this is what has to do with the allocation of funds. So in the budget, it outlines specific allocations for different sectors, and most commonly are like public utilities, education, infrastructure, any sort of law enforcement like the Defense Force, or in Trinidad and Tobago's case, like the TTPS. And when those funds are allocated in the budget, the various state bodies will use these allocations to plan and execute all of their procurement plans and purchasing activities. If you don't have budgetary approval for any of these projects or services, you simply cannot proceed. You don't say, "Hey, I'm good for the money, and I'll get it to you," because then that's just simply non-compliance. This serves as an official approval of the allocation of those funds that need to be spent. And so the second area that the budget informs public sector procurement is setting priorities. This is one of the biggest indicators of what the government determines to be at the top of the agenda. This is really interesting because I've spoken in past about the upcoming general elections in Trinidad and Tobago, and I did mention that you would see an uptick in spending. This is very common for sitting governments to spend more in the hopes that they will entice voters, will retain their existing voter base, entice undecided voters, or even convert voters who have long voted for other parties. And it's to also get their existing priorities off the ground, to kind of like tie up the money, right? So since we're entering into a general election, not later than the end of summer next year, in Trinidad and Tobago, you're going to see a ramp up on spending. So very interesting on this one. I anticipate that there's going to be additional announcements with respect to I think it'll indicate a tightening of the belt in certain respect, crackdowns in other areas, because this government is going to be very focused on revenue generation, given the financial position of the country, and they know that crime is something that needs to be addressed. Crime, crumbling schools, lack of resources and supplies in the healthcare sector. So we're going to have to wait and see where they decide to allocate those funds, and how it sets priorities for the upcoming year. Number 3 would be fiscal limits. So the budget does establish fiscal limits within which public sector procurement must operate. Again, it's a pot of money that is allocated to a priority, and you've got to execute procurements based on that pot of money. So this is really important because it does ensure that any public sector spending must align with any of the government's policies, especially fiscal in nature. So if you don't adhere to those financial limits, again, you run into the risk of overspending and having to reallocate funds in order to meet your spending and your contractual obligations. This is where you can especially demonstrate to the public value for money, and the public is taking notice more and more of how this government is spending. And it's really any government around the world. Like, where's my money going? I'm paying more taxes, but I appear to be getting less is the perception. So it's very important to have citizens on board, and particularly for elections, that's how you get them into the ballot box. So number 4, the budget influences project approval, and particularly for large-scale procurements such as infrastructure projects. It is very well known that when elections are upcoming, there's a huge uptake in roadworks happening in the country, like potholes are suddenly getting fixed. So this money is going to take care of that. What this really should do, these project approvals by way of the budget should signify like a government commitment to move forward, essentially. And number 5, for how a budget influences public sector procurement, is, I've already mentioned it, it's compliance and accountability. So a budget will provide a framework for accountability for the upcoming year, and it ensures that funds are to be spent as intended, and again aligning with any sort of policy requirements, regulatory requirements, and as well aligns with those priorities. So that leads me to number 6, which is the timing of procurements. So this is really important, and particularly when you see governments and projects get off the ground, because they're very much tied to multi-year business planning. So the timing of procurement is very important. So oftentimes the budget cycle is what influences the timing of procurement activities. So you'll oftentimes see a procurement process and a subsequent contract align with the end of a fiscal year, because you just don't know if you're going to have that budgetary commitment to carry forward with subsequent years or even optional year renewals. And number 7, speaking of the money, cost control. So when you have budget constraints, this does encourage procurement officials to seek like more cost-effective solutions, and depending on where you are in the world, certain public sector entities are utilizing more agile procurement processes and trying to think outside of the box more, and you see people using more competitive dialogue processes to ensure you're really getting bang for your buck with the vendors that you contract with. So when you have this focus on cost control, it does again often lead to more competitive bidding processes, more fulsome negotiations, and like I said before, exploring alternative suppliers as well as strategies to maximize value for money. Cost control is like, you can't even understate the importance of that in Trinidad and Tobago right now. There are billions of dollars that are unaccounted for, and in the recent report that was submitted to the government by the Office of Procurement Regulation, it very clearly highlighted the fact that there were such a significant amount of procurements that were awarded either through limited tendering or non-competitive processes, so basically sole and single sources. And it's going to be really important to ensure that we're able to track that money and that we get a handle on funds. And this is why cost control is important, again, because it requires you to go out and solicit proposals from the most amount of vendors possible. It requires you to test the market and to see if it's even feasible to enter into a contract for whatever it is you're procuring. So in general, folks, the government budget is really something that is meant to be very strategic in nature. It determines the upset limits. It gives you the priorities and it tells you basically the literal things, the goods, the services that the government can and will procure, and basically outlines the who, what, where, when, why, how, and gives you that rubber stamp approval that you're good for the money. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. I'll be back when the budget is presented to let you know what came of it.